Sullo schermo del televisore si profila una T misteriosa. Potrebbe simboleggiare il tempo. Appare infatti la donna del 2000 ed oltre, l'Eva futura. Passò quel tempo che Berta filava. Un uomo d'altri secoli si aggirerebbe quasi con sgomento tra queste geometrie d'acciaio. Aggiungiamo un nuovo significato a quella lettera T. Simboleggia anche la tecnica. Abbiamo rifatto col metallo i favolosi dinosauri, così come le prime auto non avrebbero mai immaginato che si sarebbe giunti a questi sviluppi. Ma il grande T significa anche Torino, città illustre anche nelle invenzioni e negli studi delle scienze e della tecnica. Prendete una decisione lampo, dice la donna del 2000. Venite a Torino.
Tra la fine degli anni 50
Between the end of the 1950s and the end of the 60s, we came into line with the most motorized countries in the world. And in the middle of this motor vehicle boom, there was an explosive growth in production structures, the number of workers, and production volumes, up until the end of the 1960s, with production at maximum levels. Torino has been defined as the laboratory city, and to a good extent it was, because it was a city in which the economic and social processes had become organized, with the introduction of the collective in a leading role. The workers and the industrialists, these two players were the most important in the life of the city. One part of the accumulation of energy which would allow the Fordist phase to take off grew from within a relationship of constriction, a forced relationship between the company and the worker, with the balance tipped largely in favour of the company. These were factories where you worked hard, suffered and gritted your teeth without being able to speak or go on strike. The first explosion occurred in 1962, and it was a violent explosion with the conflict in Piazza Statuto. For 3 days, the Fiat workers and the Rapid Response Police Group clashed under the UIL trade union officers, and this conflict broke out again in the hot autumn of '69 with the Great Workers' Revolt. Following on from the student uprising, it gave expression to the highest point in the development of Fordist ideology with the conflict between capital and labour, between the company and the worker within the Fordist factory. Torino really is the place where the metal mechanics platform was overturned and then rebuilt on an egalitarian basis under pressure from this mass of unqualified and unskilled labourers who made up the bulk of the workforce on the assembly line. The right to equal salaries, department reps and factory floor meetings all grew out of this. Life in the factory and life in the community, in the family, were all one and the same, really. In Torino, we confronted the problem of equitable rents and the union's proposed ideas and innovations regarding the regulation of rents and lots of other things as well. The base committees, for example, the basic units of the National Health Service were formed here in Torino. We talked about transport too, giving priority to transport from home to work. And these were some of the elements which characterized the unions as organizations which proposed new ideas. Let's say that in the 70s, the unions were not just an organization that negotiated wages, but a union which planned at a community level. We mustn't forget that the big factories creamed off the best components of the society, the youngest, newest elements. It called them in and then organised them. Now this, on the other hand, couldn't help but affect the rest of the public and private sector, which, when compared with the high performance in industry, seemed slow and sluggish. And in this way we had a tertiary industry which was less significant, with elements of administration which were weaker. And these were not really due to the weaknesses of these sectors, but to the great power of attraction exerted by the big factories over the society, which the other businesses just couldn't compete with. And this imbalance was almost inevitable. Already by the middle of the 1970s, the manufacturing process was in difficulty, and in some ways it was the Fordist model that was in difficulty on an international level. It was the time of the fuel crisis, the price of crude oil and consequently petrol rose, and at the same time the markets reached saturation level. So the automobile market and the goods market of the manufacturing industry in general became a substitution market which grew much more slowly.
Il calcolatore supervisore ha il compito di programmare la sequenza delle operazioni, distribuire le risorse, avviare le operazioni e verificarne la corretta esecuzione.
You could already foresee the signs of a change to come. These were phases of intense automation and the use of robots in production. And the situation of conflict in the factory became critical, and terrorism began to work its way in as an alternative to mass action.
Come proposta alternativa alle lotte di massa.
The defeat of the unions in the 1980s had terrorism as a precedent, a utopian uprising with a military organisation not only of the working class, but also part of the population that would subvert the system and subvert the factories. And this was damaging for us. The period of terrorism was the end of negotiation and the end of the union's role in planning for the future. We had been moving towards the future, and now we had to go back on the defensive. So the end of the 70s and the 80s came a period when you just didn't have to protect the unions from infiltration, but you had to defend the system too. The trade union movement was a major contributor in saving the system and democracy itself. The business of the 35-day strike at Fiat was a great challenge, but flawed with some great mistakes too. At the factory gates we were worn out. The action of the whole union was just used up.
Ma tutto intero il Partito Comunista Italiano è schierato con la massima decisione a fianco dei lavoratori della Fiat e di
At that time it was grave ever. The march of the 40,000 clerks and mid-level managers, though there weren't really 40,000, the march of those who wanted to go back to work overcame the resistance of those who'd stayed at the gates. This march through Torino to the City Hall to ask for the right to return to work was certainly a spectacular media event, which also determined the overturning of the relationship between the leading players in the conflict.
Il canto del cigno di quella composizione.
It was the swan song for the workers' organizations who had clung to the gates. In the face of a restructuring which was not just a political face-down in the factory between the company and the unions, but which represented a change in the system of production and the logic of production. The 35-day Fiat strike was a radical dimension in the conflict, which concluded with a terrible defeat for the unions, for the workers in general. The avant-garde of the mass movement, which had characterized the late 60s and 70s, left the factory, and then there was a long silence.
Già nella fase iniziale di stampaggio dei lamierati, il ricorso a procedure interamente automatizzate assicura assoluta precisione dimensionale.
The new technologies broke down the old teams in the factory. Not only this, but the bosses who'd become stronger attempted to find solutions to eliminate conflict or to sideline it. So the bosses invented factories where you came in and everything was all set up. The workers were moved here and there as individuals and no longer worked as a team, as they once did within the Fordist factory. The unions tried hard to understand what was happening. Let's say the unions were lax when it came to salary negotiations. The question of salaries for 10 or 15 years was just not on the union agenda, apart from minimal increases, and in these terms they're probably in difficulty even today. We've had some experience in Torino, in Fiat, of upgrading the value of the worker who's handling new technologies and moving from simple assembly to a process of self-management and quality control as well. And this meant we could request better salaries. Paradoxically, it was often the same people who had marched to free themselves from the dead weight of the unions, which they believed stopped Fiat from being competitive on the market. Those same personnel between 1993 and 1994 were eliminated from Fiat. This caused another collapse in the collective mentality within the work ethic in Torino, because even those workers who had entrusted themselves to production as a way of life, even they were terribly disillusioned and disenchanted with the way of things.
Un anno che si sperava positivo per l'economia è stato invece decisamente negativo su scala mondiale.
In the 80s, Fiat still seemed to be in good health because the Fiat of Romiti and Agnelli had triumphed over the workers. But in reality, it began to demonstrate its limitations. The finance side began to take precedence over the production side, and we began to see the accumulation of those contradictions which would take Fiat to the brink of disaster in the following decades. The 90s were years of stasis, of zero growth and heavy loss of employment. At the end of the 70s, Fiat still had 130,000 direct employees in Torino and was the backbone of this great city. These people worked in large reservoirs, in large factories. Mirafiori, more than 50,000 employees. Rivolta, 18,000. Lingotto, more than 10,000. Lancia at Chivasso near Torino had thousands more workers. The iron foundries, the steel industry, like Texid and so on. Maybe 200,000 people working directly in the motor vehicle production cycle. At the beginning of the new century, there were between 14 and 15,000 direct employees of Fiat Auto, only a tenth of that of the past. A black hole. The great production centres had been broken down. But the work hadn't just disappeared. 100,000 jobs haven't just disappeared, but they have been outsourced along a chain of sub-suppliers with micro-businesses and other small companies and even individual consultants. That cohesive body of workers which constituted the central factor of the social life of the city in the previous decades had been dissolved completely. Romiti's Fiat sat on its laurels for 15 years, surviving because of public protection, protection from the state, and profits made speculating on money exchange rates. It was a company that had its wind broken and could no longer be competitive in the market. It needed another radical change of management and of direction at the top. In the last 20 years of last century, industry in all developed nations, including Japan, was undergoing a process of radical downsizing. Our industry was losing its consistency and deep connection with the society. On the other hand, services had outgrown the volume of material and manufacturing production. Torino was part of this change which saw industry reduce its organisational, economical and social base. This didn't mean that industry would disappear from our socio-economical landscape, but rather become an isolated and limited enclave, no longer having the strength to invade or change our society as it did during the economic miracle of the 1950s.
Torino si è internazionalizzata in maniera sensibile.
In the end, this city has become international in a notable way, and not just because of the export activities of Fiat, but because of the exportation of many other businesses which are open to international interchange. Torino is discovering similar or analogous cities with whom to compare and collaborate in Europe, cities which it had not previously dealt with. A city in a phase of industrial transformation must also be a city of training and knowledge, which allows a vast number of workers, clerks and managers during their lifetimes to acquire the training necessary to design, develop, sell and distribute new products with a high level of innovation based on this learning.
Noi stiamo passando da un modello di lavoro industriale stabile.
We've evolved from a fixed industrial working model, which was fundamentally unqualified, to a multiplicity of jobs, which are different and often interesting, but which have remuneration and conditions which are not permanent. This creates problems for youngsters who want to change their professional position and improve it without jeopardizing the level of well-being that our community has already acquired.
Nessuno scommette su di una città in declino.
Nobody will bet on a city in decline, especially when its industry is not running well. If the city shows that it's willing to invest in culture and that it has new resources, then it becomes a city which is worth investing in.
Merita investire.
Dichiaro aperta a Torino la celebrazione dei 20esimi Giochi Olimpici Invernali.
Cultura vuol dire anche eventi culturali.
Culture also means cultural events, large exhibitions, and even the Winter Olympics, which was on an international scale, and cultural and not just sport-based, which have helped the city to change its image.
Tutta la trasformazione di cui abbiamo parlato finora,
all of the transformation which we've spoken about before has required a lot of public spending, money from the European Union, which has sustained the operations of urban renewal, spending on a local level which supported the Olympic event itself. But Torino, however, pays back this money through the businesses which are stimulated and through the image created by these activities, which also contributes to making the Fiat miracle seem credible and lasting.
Il miracolo Fiat. Tutte le città che hanno promosso una trasformazione come quella di Torino.
Every city which has promoted a transformation like Torino's has placed the quality of life in first place. You have to do both things together. You have to develop international competitivity and not neglect social integration and the quality of life. The people we want to attract are people drawn to a beautiful, attractive city, which is also safe, without ghettos, without poor people, but a city where poor people really don't exist, not just where they're hidden away.
Non ci sono I poveri, ma non ci sono davvero, non perché vengono nascosti.
Torino has to reinvent itself, but with a skill which up till now had not been sufficiently developed. This means safeguarding the memory of its past. The risk that we take with engineers and architects is that of levelling everything down to the ground. This is also because we often have to clean up the soil after it's been polluted by the factory. These experts also tend not to take into account that people who have lived in a certain area have a passion for certain things and for certain symbols. If we want a community which meets and talks, then we have to find a way that the memory of the past is in some way built into designing the new environment. Unfortunately, the first and biggest proponents of change were the real estate developers who tended to design according to their own interests and not according to the need to build a new city. The city council was later able to patch up and recoup, above all by taking back ownership of the territory.
L'importanza primaria oggi è certamente quella della istituzione comunale.
The thing of primary importance today is certainly the local community. Then there's the importance of the sociologist and the architect who know how to suggest solutions which render the integration and continuity of the old and the new.
Tra la memoria e il nuovo.
There's a complex inheritance left by a great industrial tradition to the local community. Torino stands out because it certainly has a level of organizational skill which is much higher than the average in our country. There are also some elements of executive efficiency which mustn't be lost. What Torino has done in the last few years, which is positive, is to rediscover a history, a culture and a tradition which goes well beyond the historical limits of industrialization. If we think about the importance that the Torino City Council might have had in the 50s and 60s, and then we compare this with what it had become at the turn of the century, then between the end of the 1990s and the year 2000, we see an almost incomparable difference. I think that the transformation of Torino in this last decade would not have taken place, or certainly not with this level of efficiency, if the society had not been able to encourage in its train a variety of other economic and social entities which have agreed to think in chorus.
Ragionare in modo corale.
La Torino grigia e ferrigna degli anni 60.
While the iron grey Torino of the 60s was a city that was not very aesthetically pleasing, but which had deep roots and a good sense of identity. The people of Torino knew perfectly well who they were. Today's Torino is a city with a highly fragile identity. It is no longer a product of its history or its people, but an identity linked to a less concrete reality based on cultural events presented on stages. Each time this new identity is recreated, it's always with a considerable level of uncertainty.
Nella quale però tutto è molto incerto.
This capacity to welcome and host that the city has demonstrated was by no means automatic. It was not a result of the good character of the people of Torino, but was introduced through social conflict. Now, from this point of view, social conflict, which, as we know, involved a high cost, but which was a great vehicle for integration, creating a common language, and which broke, for example, the language barriers which prevailed in the union movement and the workers' organizations of the time, when the main form of communication, for example, was in Piemontese dialect. This factor of participation through conflict was very important for integration. And this is lacking today, because the various ethnic components are highly mobile, and there's no longer the great catalyst of social conflict in collective demonstrations to create a cohesive element and bring together the new elements in the social mixing pot, which is the new Torino. This participation through conflict no longer exists, though, and that's why I think we have a city which is more segmented. It's more pleasant than before for those who live and use all of the resources it offers, but for the new arrivals, it's more difficult to participate completely. There is credibility and trust in the trade unions on the part of the immigrants, because the unions listen to them. This means that there is the possibility of having dialogue and rapport and of understanding the difficulties that the new arrivals have in growing and maturing here. This timeline is perhaps a little slower than that of the southern Italians who came here before, but I think their integration is a positive factor. We also have African delegates who are representatives and who represent their own ethnic groups.
Rappresentare anche il loro gruppo etnico.
Our social system does not produce the resources that it needs, so it has to continually dip into demographic resources which are not produced within our society. Now, this means calling in new immigrants, but each time we do, they come from realities further removed and more culturally different from our own. Now, this presents us with an ever greater challenge, because finding balance and guaranteeing efficient integration is becoming increasingly difficult as time goes by.
Di